Hello and welcome to Ethiopia Insight's first episode of the Bridge the Divide podcast series. This is your host, Emmanuel Yirdaw. Bridge the Divide podcast series is a new podcast project at Ethiopia Insight where we will try and talk to a diverse group of people across the Ethiopian political landscape. Our main objective here is creating a platform where we can share ideas and have the much-needed, nuanced conversation about Ethiopia and Ethiopian affairs without the now prevalent and rapidly increasing polarization preventing us from doing so. Fingers crossed at the thought that we will indeed somewhat bridge the divide. My guest today is Dr. Adem Kassie Abebe. Adem has a doctorate degree in law from the University of Pretoria in South Africa, and he now works at the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, where he supports constitution and peace-building process in countries moving from authoritarianism and war to peace and democracy. Adem is a keen observer of Ethiopian affairs and has written on Ethiopia for many outlets, including Ethiopia Insight. The broad focus of today's conversation is an article he published for Foreign Policy magazine titled A Blueprint for Peace in Ethiopia on November 12 of this year. In the article, Adem discussed a possible peace and negotiation process in Ethiopia. Among others, he argued that the first priority of all parties engaged in the Ethiopian war should be silencing the guns, followed by the federal government restoring basic services in Tigray. Mutual recognition between the Tigray government and the federal government and Tigrayan forces withdrawing from all lands that they have occupied were also part of his proposal. On the much more thorny issue of Western Tigray, Adem argued that a joint body representing both Amhara and Tigrayan residents of the areas should have political control of the area, while federal forces could take care of security matters. Furthermore, Adem argued that the roots of political contestation in Ethiopia should be dealt with an all-inclusive national dialogue. I and Adem have discussed about his article, possible peace process, our concerns about the growing polarization, and many other issues about the conflict in Ethiopia. Please keep in mind that this episode was recorded on the 3rd of December. Many thanks for tuning in. Enjoy. Okay, thank you so much, my friend, for being here. I really appreciate it. So before we go any further, I want to give you a few minutes to briefly introduce yourself to our audience, and then we will go to the more serious matter of Ethiopian politics. So go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. The pleasure is mine. So my name is Adem Kassie Abebe. I work for the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I primarily support constitutional reform processes and countries that are transitioning from conflict and authoritarianism to democracy and peace. And particularly on Ethiopia, I'm Ethiopian. I've lived there my entire life, and I closely follow the developments there. And now and then I also scribble down my ideas. So I can consider myself a keen observer of Ethiopian politics.
Okay, thank you so much. So as I have said, the focus of today's podcast is going to be the piece that you published for Foreign Policy magazine titled "The Blueprint for Peace in Ethiopia." So in the piece, you have discussed various issues concerning the civil war, and you've shared your reflections regarding negotiations, the peace process, and other related matters. But before we go into that, I want to briefly discuss about the battlefield situation. So it seems like after being on the more or less defensive side, the ENDF and allies, federal troops and allies, seem like they're gaining more momentum the last few days, and towns in North Shawa, in Wollo, are now captured by Ethiopian forces. And so my question to you is generally, I want your reflection on that, but like a specific question would be, where do you see this going in the coming days and weeks? So let's briefly discuss that before we go into the main issue.
Well, no, you're right. The federal government and its allied forces have, at least since June 2021, been in a defensive position. And the TPLF in particular in the center, in the Wollo front, has been advancing, engaging in a dynamic offensive. And that seems to have been brought to a halt. And in fact, the federal forces and their allies seem to be gaining ground. But my overall assessment remains that the conflict is a stalemate. The balance shifts now and then to one or the other side. But it is very difficult at this particular stage to say, this side or that side is close to a victory. And even if the federal government, and that is, I think, the immediate goal seems to be to try and push Tigrayan forces out of Amhara region and out of Afar region, and if possible, also try and cut off a large battalion of the Tigrayan forces to cut them off so that they weaken the TPLF. But overall, I think at this particular moment, even if now the momentum has shifted again towards the federal forces and its allies, I think it's far from over, and the sense of stalemate continues.
Okay, so like you said, lots of speculations. It's extremely hard, if not completely impossible, to be sure as to where this conflict is heading when it comes to the battlefield situation. But now I think it's now a good time to go to your piece. Once again, the article that you published for Foreign Policy, A Blueprint for Peace in Ethiopia. First off, I want to ask you, what initiated this blueprint? What led you to write it? What was going on in your mind at the time? So like generally your kind of brief reflection on the article, and then we can go to the details.
Well, so the first one is that I think even if one side secures victory on the war front, it will be an incomplete victory. It will only be a matter of time before whichever side has lost in whatever sense rebuilds and engages in war again. So settlement of what is happening through war would be an incomplete settlement. That's very important. And secondly, I also think that there's a lot of accusations of war crime and crimes against humanity and even genocide. But in any case, the war has led to tremendous suffering. Whatever we call it, the suffering cannot be denied. And any continuation of this, the longer this conflict continues, there's only one certainty. We don't know if either side will be victorious, but we know that the suffering would multiply, would quadruple and triple and quadruple. And so I think the situation can be brought to an end and more effectively through a negotiated settlement. I think both sides have ideas, both sides have interests that they want to protect, and they are more likely to gate them or at least to get close to them through negotiation rather than through continuing the conflict. And of course, I think after I wrote the piece, I came to realize that this war, I believe, started first as a struggle for power in the center. I don't think there was any real threat of centralization of power as the Tigrayans have tried to put it. It started as a power struggle in Addis Ababa, and then it was given an ideological coverage and all of that. But since then, I think it is really not about power. It's really not about of territory, contested lands, not even ideology. I think it has come now to be a core battle for what each side considers to be of dignity. And so, the piece, and I think it's important to mention, the piece focuses on the struggles are based on territory, based on power, and based on ideology. But there is an underlying, the conflict has sort of shifted into more, as a battle of dignity. So we need to consider it. But at the same time, I still realize, and I believe that the fundamental issues underlying the conflict remain, and both sides are more likely to get closer to their goals, to achieve their objectives through a negotiated process rather than through war. Of course, there's a lot of mistrust. Of course, there's a lot of attack, and the Tigrayans were blaming the federal government and its allied forces of atrocities, and since they invaded Tigray and Afar, now the accusations have turned, and some of the pictures and recordings that we see are extremely gloomy. So this sense of revenge and all of that obviously reduces the chances for a negotiated settlement. But ultimately, I think victory through war is uncertain, and a negotiated settlement, I believe, is still the way forward, even as the two parties remain tied up in what I believe is an intractable conflict.
Right. So that was the reasoning behind the article you published. Now, the problem, it seems to me, when it comes to endorsing negotiations, is at various points, both parties, both the federal government and allies, and also the Tigrayan forces, TDF, both think that they can win this war decisively, and there is a military solution to this, right? So initially it was the Tigray leadership, calling for negotiations. They put out preconditions, and so on. But then, as they were gaining momentum, most notably, this was a comment made by General Assad, and he said, "There's no negotiation. The war is now effectively over," right? And now, when as the Ethiopian side, federal troops are gaining momentum, they might end up thinking that they can win the war decisively, and there is no need for negotiations. And I'm actually seeing that kind of sentiment on social media, among other places on Twitter. The people thinking we can still go to Tigray, we can still oust the leadership, basically doing the same thing that the federal government did back in late November, when they captured the capital city of Tigray. So I think the main obstacle standing on the way of negotiations is the thinking that this war can be won decisively, and that's the problem. But then you don't think that's the case. You don't think the war can be won decisively, and so naturally, you support negotiations, and so do I. So I think like that's the piece of the puzzle. If you think the war can be won, you won't be for negotiations. But then about preconditions now. So we have an idea, like it's kind of ambiguous, but we have an idea of what both sides would set out for negotiations. So for the Tigrayan side, there's the issue of the humanitarian blockade, which we will discuss. There is the restoration of basic services, including banking, telecommunication, and electric power. On the federal side, I think that the main one is that the Tigrayan leadership recognizes the federal government as a legitimate government, and also that the TDF fighters withdraw from Afar and Amhara, the lands that they have occupied, as they try to advance to on the Afar side to capture Mille and the Wollo front to go to North Shah and ultimately capture Addis. So this seems to be like the preconditions, at least in my mind. So what do you think is out there? What do you think are they thinking? What are the preconditions from both sides? And I want to hear your reflection on that.
Well, I think maybe just a quick note on what you said about both sides believing that they could win the war. I think, we should not always take what they say in public as evidence of that. Obviously, if you are engaged in war, in any public engagement, you have to say you have the capacity to win it, because otherwise that could demoralize your soldiers, your fighters, and essentially your constituency. So the public utterances are more targeted towards their own constituencies, their specific constituencies, rather than to the other side. So I think we have to take whatever they say with a pinch of salt. That is one. In terms of preconditions, I think obviously it has shifted now and then, but obviously you cannot start negotiation except when you both recognize the validity of the claims of each other. You have to recognize each other's existence. So it goes without saying that if they sit for negotiation, then they would have to recognize each other. I think that goes without saying, and there are things that follow from that, including, for instance, if the federal government agrees to recognize the TPLF, then they would have to lift the terrorism designation and other things. And that's one. Secondly, I think in terms of the humanitarian blockade, I think it's not accurate to call it blockade. I think it is restricted. I don't think it's blocked. It is heavily restricted, but it doesn't constitute a blockade in my opinion. But in any case, I think it is humanitarian situation should be alleviated, and in my opinion should not even be part of any negotiation. I think it should happen. Of course, as long as there is an active conflict, you cannot expect humanitarian provisions and other things to be a walk in the park. And so as long as there is offensive, we can expect disruptions and restrictions to tighten. So you may agree that humanitarian provisions should be allowed in, but if there is conflict, it is to be expected, in my opinion, that there will be restrictions. So those two, I think, in terms of mutual recognition and what follows from that and the humanitarian situation, I don't think there is. I think if there is willingness to negotiate, those I think would be the list of the problems. Now the challenge comes afterwards, and I think first is that especially in relation to the contested territorial claims in the West, the TPLF considers it as a fundamental matter of justice that they should start from where the war started. On the other hand, if you look at the Amhara regional government and the Amhara in general, they say that this is something that was taken from us and now we have reclaimed it. And again, it is a matter of justice that we shouldn't give it up. That is one. And for the federal government and also for the Amhara government, it is also a fundamental issue of security. If the TPLF, it is a group that has already shown the capacity, even after being encircled, it is a group that has shown the capacity to go on an offensive and even claim to threaten the capital, and of course also to claim to threaten the artery that connects the capital with the main port of Djibouti. And so if you provide them with another extra access to potential source of weapons and other materials, it would be the federal government and the Amhara regional forces would essentially be shooting themselves in the foot. So I think it's a no-go for the federal government and for the Amhara regional government. It is a no-go for the TPLF to control it. So what I suggest is that considering these inherently very difficult, very contradictory demands, what could be possible is that instead of thinking in terms of Amhara and Tigray regional governments, we think about the locals, the people that live there, that have lived there for decades, and that power, the political power, can be exercised by them. But the security power in that regard would be exercised by the federal government as a legitimate authority of the state. So obviously, this is a very difficult compromise, and both parties don't like it, especially the Amhara regional government doesn't want to leave, and the Tigray regional government also doesn't want to leave. And Tigray regional government particularly doesn't want to trust the federal government in terms of security. But the Amhara regional government also doesn't want to weaken its claims by leaving. So it is a very difficult compromise. But compromise is exactly what is needed if you want to move from a state of war to a state of peace.
So it is interesting you said that. So as you have stated, what you've said on the foreign policy piece is a possible compromise is for the TPLF to withdraw its forces from Afar and Amhara areas, and Amhara forces withdraw from Wolqayt Tsagade. And now, as you've pointed out, that's highly problematic because this irredentist claim by the Amhara side is this is a land that belongs to us, land of our forefathers. And then after all this, you know, it's quite, it just doesn't make sense for us to withdraw. So that's a very difficult positioning from the Amhara side. But then even within the government, even within the Prosperity Party, at least to my mind, they're not quite sure as to what they're supposed to do with this. I mean, you have factions obviously in the Amhara Prosperity Party who think Western Tigray and then also Southern Tigray, places like Raya, rightly belong to them. But then you have also other elements within the Prosperity Party, within the government itself, who think that's a no-go. And then part of the reason is this is setting a very bad precedent. Basically, if Amhara forces are going to take Western Tigray, basically annexing it by force, right? I mean, I happen to think, for instance, personally, that there is a legitimate reason for the claims. But then regardless of that, if they're going to annex Western Tigray by force, this is setting a very bad precedent. The precedent being, whenever a region has a dispute, a land dispute with a neighboring region, the region is well justified to invade the other region and then reclaim whatever land they think is there. So this is setting a very bad precedent for the federation, for regions of the federation as we go forward, and also for the constitutional order. That I think is highly problematic. But then with that being said, I really want to go back to what you said earlier about the humanitarian concern, the aid blockade and stuff like that. Now, part of the reason that we're doing this, the podcast, Bridge the Divide, is it seems to me, and I think this is a correct assessment, we have reached a point where you have various camps within the Ethiopian political landscape, and then basically it's like an echo chamber. No one is interested in listening to the other side. So for instance, initially when the war began, you had reputable international human rights organizations saying that Eritrean troops are involved and they're committing atrocity, war crimes, most notably the Aksum massacre. And then you had people kind of broadly speaking, pro-federal government saying that's not true. These organizations are lying. This is a TPLF propaganda. It was extremely stressful, very stressful for not only for the Tigrayan activists, but even for me and people like me. It's just like, it was almost impossible to have a conversation. And now you say the same thing regarding the aid blockade. Now the Tigrayan positioning is that aid is being blocked, or like in a kind of systematic way, right? Now, for instance, no fuel truck has entered Tigray since early August. And so some organizations were forced to suspend operations within Tigray. And then even aid trucks were restricted. I think after October 18, no aid trucks has entered Tigray via the Afar Samara route, which at this point is the only route to go to Tigray. And the main issue here was the bureaucratic delay and stuff like that. And my thinking is that the other side, though, is not interested in acknowledging this, right? To the point, the claim is that this is just a TPLF propaganda. This is not happening. We don't trust anyone. So how do you really bridge the divide when you're talking across, in this way? Like, how do we move forward?
Yeah. So first, I think the first point you talked about territorial claims. I think it's, you are right in terms of the concern that territorial disputes should be provided proper procedures. There are legal procedures that must be pursued to resolve them. But I think it is inaccurate to think that this war was about territory. So the territorial claim is a consequence of a war that started, that was about other things. So, the Amharas had territorial claims naturally, and it kind of fed into the overall context that led to the war. But the Amhara ceding those lands is only a consequence of the war. That is not the cause of the war. So I think it is a very important distinction to make. And as I said, at the moment, it is really not about territorial claims anymore. It's a fundamental issue of security for both the federal government and the Amhara regional government to control that part of the country. And because, as I said, if it is open, it will provide access to potential military support that would fundamentally undermine the security of the country. So that's why I think it is beyond territory now. It is beyond history now. It is about fundamental. It's about today. It is about security. That's one. But I agree with your overall concern that any issue around territory should be resolved through legal procedure. And it's important also to remember that there were efforts. The Amharas actually sought on several occasions to try and follow legal procedure to resolve the issues, and they were met with violence and other unlawful responses. So that's one. Secondly, in terms of the humanitarian situation, you're right. The Tigrayans claim that there is an effective blockade. That's a language they use. But I said it's a restriction because, just like you pointed out, there has been certainly not nearly sufficient, but there has been a flow of support, especially support that doesn't include fuel. That's one. And secondly, you're right. I think since 8 October, from 8 to October to about late November, nothing moved in. But on the 24th or so, I think more than 100 something trucks were allowed in. And I understand that there are about 300 or so trucks that are actually waiting final permission to go in.
They're in Samara, yeah.
Yes, they are in Samara. So I think, blockade means nothing is going in. I think it's very important. It is restricted. There's no question about that. There is an extreme restriction. And we might argue whether the restriction, the scope of the restriction is legitimate or not. But there is an active war going on. And even with the restriction, it is a regime that has managed, the TPLF is a group that has managed to fight and create significant threats to the government and all of that. That's one. And secondly, I think, if you are invading areas that are supposed to be the sole access points for you, you're obviously angering people. And if you look at Afar, if you look at Amhara, they also have their own significant humanitarian needs. And so, quite frankly, the TPLF should also take the blame for what is happening. I think in June, before they started engaging in an offensive, they could have waited for some time, but they didn't want to because they thought they had the military advantage. They thought victory might be too close, so they engaged in a very aggressive offensive that actually complicated the situation further.
Right. So yeah, it is true that truckloads are arriving in Mekelle. I think between 18 October and November 30, around 150 truckloads have arrived. However, keep in mind, according to the UN, around 100 trucks a day are needed, right? 80 to 100. So probably around 4% of the aid demanded is reaching Tigray, which is extremely concerning. But then I really don't want to spend time on this. But my general concern is that the opposing camps are unwilling to really understand the concern of the other camp, right? So when the Tigrayan activists talk about the various concerns that they have about what they think is a humanitarian blockade or a humanitarian restriction, according to you, the various worries, like whether it's the sexual violence, the massacres, the various atrocities committed within Tigray. The response from the other camp was, this is just, generally speaking, and not the whole camp, but then generally the narrative was, this is just a TPLF propaganda. There's no merit to their concern, and we just the policy, it seemed to me, was just ignore them, like, don't engage with them, like who cares? And now similarly, as the ground forces were advancing through Amhara region and Afar region, it was not peaceful, as the Tigrayan leadership was, trying to tell us, the people are welcoming, they're passing. Well, that wasn't true. And atrocities were committed in Afar. Atrocities were committed in Wollo by the Tigrayan fighters, right? So, for instance, Amnesty International on November 9 came out with a report detailing how TPLF fighters, raped many women at gunpoint. I think you mentioned that on your piece as well. They looted and damaged hospitals, and they engaged in similar crimes in Afar. There were various reports of extrajudicial killings by Tigrayan fighters in Amhara. And then most recently, I think on November 29 or the 30th, Lucy Casa for Globe and Mail reported on, gang rapes committed by Tigrayan fighters on Amhara. I think it was in either in Gondar or Wollo. I mean, like little girls as little as 12 years old were raped. It's just like extremely brutal. But no, the problem though is that the positioning, it seems to me, of the Tigrayan positioning right now is that no, that's not true. That's propaganda. So the same thing that the pro-federal government camp was saying during the first 8 months of the war. And now that it seems to me that the Tigrayan activists, including the Tigray government, the Tigray leadership, are saying the same thing, which is it's just like how can you move forward if you basically say whatever comes out from the other camp is just a propaganda, we don't have to pay attention to it? Like, how do we bridge the divide? It's just, if you deny every report, how exactly can you move forward? That's pretty frustrating to me.
It is frustrating, but I think it's very important, maybe for context. If you exclude the war context, already before the war started, if you remember the peaceful demonstration 2005 and before, and particularly also since the protests against the TPLF-led EPRDF were happening, we remember what was happening against peaceful protesters. And so the killings, the illegal detentions, and the violence was happening even in the context of peaceful demonstrations. And so, whether we like it or not, we have a security infrastructure, a security structure that has shown to be violent even in context of peace. And so I'm not surprised that there has been a lot of violence on both of accusations of violence on both sides, because for me, I know what the security forces are capable of doing even in peacetime, let alone in a context of war. So if you think about that, I'm not surprised that there has been a lot of violence. One, and secondly, I think it's very important as well. The run up to the war, before the first guns were fired by the TPLF on the night of November 3, there was a lot of demonization of one another. There was a lot of virtual, media propaganda trying to portray the other, and not as competitors, but as demons, as demons on a mission to wipe the other out. And so in that context, it is not, for me, you know, it's obviously not legitimate. It's never justified, but you could see what was about to come. So I think if you look at the brutality of the media, the propaganda itself, the violence is for me, I'm not surprised. As bad as it is, as terrible as it is, I'm not surprised. And so, okay. You know, you're right that each side doesn't want to recognize it, and it's not abnormal. When you are in war, you consider whatever the other says as propaganda. But I think, you know, fortunately, of course, the Tigrayan side have said they don't trust the joint investigation between the UN and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. But I think, you know, credit to them, they have pointed out, they have identified serious violations that they managed to record. And so there is enough evidence of the atrocities committed in Tigray. And I'm sure there will be enough of that when investigations in Afar and Amhara are done about atrocities committed by the Tigrayans.
Right. So if I may say a few things, which I think I forgot to say earlier, about the joint investigation by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. And as you've said, Tigrayans are generally concerned about the joint investigation, but the concern is not without any foundation. So the concern is, first, you know, they're saying the involvement of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission in the investigation casts doubts on the integrity of the overall investigation. You know, we don't have a lot of precedent of that happening, involving a national human rights organization in such an investigation, and also the commission, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, is accountable to the Ethiopian House of People's Representative, which is a body that designated the TPLF a terrorist organization. It's basically accountable to the Ethiopian government. So, you know, this, at the very least, raises, you know, questions of independence and impartiality. So that's the other concern that they have. And also, the report, the actual report has, for instance, has not said anything about I think the well-documented Aksum massacre, right? Has not said much about other atrocities, including the Mariam Dengelat, the Mahabara Dogo, the Agoga airstrikes, the Temben massacre. It's just like, my point here is that the Tigrayan activists may have a point when they say it might not be independent. There's serious issues with impartiality, and all that stuff. But I really don't want to stay here because
I think, just to agree with you, I think they indeed have a legitimate reason to be concerned. I think you know, we have to recognize that. That's one, and at the same time as well, I think we have to recognize that there has been some fundamental change, and you're right that there were some places that were not investigated, and that is partly because they couldn't access those places, because while they were investigating, the turn of events on the front line changed, so they couldn't cover them. And also, you know, it's not just those places that were not covered, and since the June, the war front has changed completely. So there's other areas that have not been investigated as well. So basically, they have a legitimate claim, but I think the Tigrayans have also decided, a lot of the Tigrayan activists have decided that anybody or anything that disagrees with them, particularly in terms of their, for me, is extremely unfounded designation of what is happening as genocide, they just reject anyone, and they have rejected Antonio Guterres. They reject everybody that does not agree with their characterization. It's not just the violence; it's a characterization of the violence. And you know, words like genocide, I don't know, these are legal concepts. There are processes that must be followed before that judgment is made. And it's also very important to recognize the mandate of the joint investigative reports. They were not there to say crimes against humanity were committed or like genocide was committed or this was committed. They were there to ascertain the facts, what happened. They were not there to characterize those facts. That is the job of a subsequent, more judicial investigation.
Yeah, no, I do agree with you, and I do agree with you in the sense that, for instance, the genocide claim, I think, is a serious matter. It's not a word that you can use loosely, right? So, and so, yes, I mean, before we designate it as genocide, we want to make sure that the relevant international human rights bodies have made a thorough investigation, and then they can reach a decision before we can say anything. But then what you said about Tigrayan activists dismissing basically any statement, any positioning that doesn't align with the grand narrative that they have, that's what I was trying to allude to earlier. Like both camps completely dismissing any point that doesn't go hand in hand with whatever grand position or grand narrative that they have. It's not only the grand camp. Now, I really don't want to stay here though, because we have a few other issues that I want us to discuss. So one issue. So one thing I want to go back to the path to negotiation and lasting peace that you've kind of touched upon earlier, but I think I kind of cut you in part because I wanted to discuss about the humanitarian issues. But so when you say it on your piece and also here that one precondition for both sides would be mutual recognition of each other, through the federal government recognizing the Tigray government and the Tigray government recognizing the federal government. So how exactly are they going to do that? Because basically this is the constitutional dispute that we went through in 2020, which has not been resolved. The federal government postponed the election, through constitutional means, by constitutional interpretation, in which you are also part of the expert panel on the Council of Constitutional Inquiry. So the positioning of the federal government is that the election was postponed in a constitutional way, legal way, and then the federal government, the Tigray government, was basically defying the federal authority, defying the constitutional order, the constitutional interpretation by the relevant body, in this case being the House of Federation. So how exactly are they going to do that? Are we not going back to 2020? So how exactly can they recognize each other?
Well, so it is in the nature of every peace process that if the parties want to negotiate, the starting point is sort of, you have to recognize each other as key actors. So if you look at every peace process, that is what it is. And so if there's commitment to peace, you have to recognize each other. I don't think there's anything around it. One, and secondly, the point you made about the elections, that was really not so much about recognition, but it was about whether elections could be held on time. And then, of course, the debates around that led to the claims of legitimacy and illegitimacy subsequently. But you're right that there is a legal process. We might disagree with it. We might disagree with the outcome in particular. But rule of law fundamentally is about decisions we do not agree with. And I think in that sense, the TPLF had the responsibility to respect a constitution that it led the adoption of, one, and it also, in particular, a constitutional interpretation mechanism that it was the lead architect of, even if they disagreed with the outcome in this particular time. And so, I don't think, for me, even I myself had ideas that were not fully endorsed by the decision, but ultimately the definition of rule of law is that you must accept things that you don't agree with. Because if you're only talking about things you agree with, there's no point of rule of law. So that's important. But to go back to the first point, For me, I do not have any sympathy for the TPLF. I do not have sympathy for the cause they stand for, but I respect that. I respect that they have a constituency, whether it's manipulated or not, but they have a constituency that supports them, one. And secondly, I also want to say that I think the TPLF played a massive role in the start of the war, and they were certainly the first ones to pull the first trigger. At the same time, the conditions that made war extremely likely, almost, and at hindsight inevitable, were created by the rhetoric that was coming from the federal government, from the Amhara government, and of course the rhetoric and aggression that was coming from the TPLF, and also the role of the Eritrean government, particularly Isaias Afwerki. So I have sympathy to the TPLF only to the extent that I think they were not the sole actors that were responsible for the start of the war. And that is why I think we need to, I don't want to blame them for the start of the war. I don't want to blame them to be, I don't want to blame them alone for that. And in that sense, it's important that if we want to pursue peace at the moment, mutual recognition is a precondition. But that is if we want to pursue peace.
Right. But then my worries though on your piece, the blueprint piece. So you're basically saying that, for instance, the TPLF should be allowed to send representatives to both houses of the federal parliament until such time as elections can be held in the region. So this is a quote from your piece. Now, it seems to me that you're saying negotiations are to be conducted within the constitutional framework, right? Now, if that is the case, then what we have in the eyes of the federal government, what you have in Tigray is an illegitimate government. And so how exactly, legally speaking, how exactly can you turn this illegitimate government into a legitimate government to the point that it is allowed to send representatives to the parliament and can, further negotiate at the center? How exactly can you do that? Do you have any legal footing? That's the concern.
Well, there's two things. First, it is that what is happening is extremely complex, so we cannot see it alone. We cannot see it from the perspective of the law and the constitution alone. That's one. And secondly, even if we look at it from the constitutional perspective, technically, the TPLF would still be the government. So they had organized the election. So it's not the TPLF that, the members that were elected in that particular election, but the TPLF before that would technically be the legitimate government. So there is legal interpretations around it that could create the conditions. But it's very important that this is not simply about the constitution. And if there is agreement, if there is a political process, and if there is a fear that undermines the current constitutional framework, we can always adapt the constitution to fit into that. And so, we can always change the constitution if there is an agreement that both parties can live with. For me, the main challenge at the moment is not the law. The main challenge is what you said earlier. It is that each party does not only reject the legitimacy of the other, they reject the cause of the other. They consider the one as a mortal enemy that needs to be eliminated. So for me, the main hindrance to peace is not so much the law, it's not so much the constitution. It is the political differences and also the psychological differences around the nature and character that each perceives of the other.
Okay, no, that's I agree with you. So I think what you said there about even though the 2020 elections that the Tigray regional government held was in the eyes of the federal government, and also I agree with this positioning. Like, if we are talking about the rule of law and then constitutionalism, I think this was the regional election was held in defiance of basically the Constitution, because the House of Federation is the sole authority when it comes to interpreting the Constitution. So whatever the House says is binding, and so they were defying that. And so that, at least to my mind, was unconstitutional. But then, as you've pointed out, and I was thinking about this, for past few weeks, yeah, we can say, the 2020 elections were illegitimate, but TPLF is still in power because of the 2015 elections, right? So basically, we can say no elections were held in Tigray, or the federal government could say no elections were held in Tigray, and so the existing authority, namely the authority from that took power during the 2015 elections, would continue to be in power, and then they can come to parliament and we can continue negotiations. So that would make sense, at least legally speaking. Now, another thing that I want to discuss before we run out of time is the pre-war developments. You kind of touched upon it earlier, right? So you talked about the November 4 incident where Tigrayan forces attacked the ENDF's military base in Tigray, the constitutional dispute, obviously, and then the hostile relationship between Tigray and the federal government. You touched upon that. So, like, how do you so you say, TPLF is not the only body to be blamed. The federal government also has to take blame. But generally speaking, the pro-federal government positioning is that TPLF is the sole culprit in this. TPLF is the only responsible body. So how do you, like briefly, if you could explain, like, how do you view the pre-war development? You can start you don't have to go into the details, obviously, but then you can go back to 2018, Abiy coming to power, and then the pre-war developments up until the November 4 incident, and then I might interject every now and then and push back on some of your claims. But how do you view the development? I really want to get a sense of it.
If I can characterize the 2.5 or so years between Abiy's rise to power and the conflict, I think I'll summarize it in 2 words, and that is mistrust and fear. I think for me that's what it was. Already before Abiy became a prime minister, the TPLF didn't want him, and they were clear about it. That is one. And then after he came to power, that mistrust really was never really recovered. And so, in addition to the power struggle, there was a lot of mistrust that was happening. And Abiy, particularly, he managed to have that popular support, popular legitimacy, and he used that power to try and claim power in the center, powers that he is entitled to constitutionally, but most of them were controlled by the TPLF. So the TPLF feared that they were losing power too quickly in Addis. And there was a lot of fear, a lot of concern in terms of what was the next move from the central government. And so, that mistrust, that fear created big problems. And in particular, when Abiy went ahead against the objections and concerns of the TPLF to set up a prosperity party and dismantle the federal government, that essentially cut off the only formal line that connected the TPLF with the federal government. Once the party, the APRDF, was gone, there was really no line of communication. And unfortunately, as a country in Ethiopia, we do not have formal intergovernmental mechanisms of cooperation and of coordination. And so when the APRDF was dead, that was it. So every other communication had to be either personal or through shimagiles, essentially individuals and other actors trying to bring the two parties together. And so all of that widened the mistrust, and also the ethnic, the inter-ethnic conflicts everywhere across the country were also blamed on the TPLF. So there was a lot of mistrust and a lot of fear. And I think whenever there is mistrust, whenever there is fear, everybody assumes the worst of the other, and you prepare on that based on that assumption. I think both sides were preparing for potential conflict, even if they didn't want to engage in it. They were all getting ready for it. And there is a saying in English which says that for anyone who has a hammer, a person who has a hammer thinks everything is a nail. And so, the stronger you feel like it, the stronger you are in terms of armed rivalry, you are more likely to deploy it. And of course, there is the rhetoric. So there is a mistrust, there is a fear, and there is a rhetoric that made the fear and the mistrust even worse. And the language that was used, particularly against Tigrayans, but also the Tigrayans against Abiy Ahmed and all. If you consider all of that, both of them were essentially throwing wood and fuel into the fire. And so, we can attribute more or less blame to either side, but I think all sides, particularly from Abiy's side, particularly, I think after or just before Prosperity Party was formed, and then afterwards the rhetoric was just poisonous. So considering that, I think for me, all sides had a role in making the war very likely and ultimately inevitable. And I think
what's problematic here is the narrative that the federal government and pro-federal government activists are trying to portray is the sense that they're trying to create is that it is as if the war started when the TPLF forces attacked the ANDF base in Tigray, right? It started in November 4. There is this tendency to view it as a kind of isolated incident. There is no context, there is no nuance. Like everything was peaceful, and then November 4th, they attacked the ANDF base, and then obviously we had to respond. It was a self-defense, a law enforcement operation. Which I found extremely problematic. Now, what is interesting, though, is on November 11 this year, Prime Minister Abiy, on this discussion panel called Addis Wag, actually said, fixating on November 4. So he thinks the November 4 incident, according to him, is just the triggering point. But he said what led to the war are structural problems, multifaceted, extremely complex, and then fixating on the triggering point doesn't help in alleviating the problem. So this is from the Prime Minister himself, which I found extremely interesting, because to my mind, this runs against the narrative by his base, basically saying, they don't literally say it, but then they're alluding to it in the sense that it's like there's no context to this. It's just the TPLF attacked us on November 4, and then we had to engage in self-defense, which I found extremely problematic. And also, when we talk about actual war preparation, we have evidence that the federal government was preparing for a military confrontation, at least starting from late October, right? So, for instance, we have the admission from the late Amhara police commissioner, Adem, who said, the Amhara regional state had already done its homework, and I'm quoting him by the way, and he said the deployment of forces had taken place on our borders from east to west. The war started that night after we have already completed our preparation. So it seems to me that it was like a matter of days, like the preparation was there, like an actual preparation for an imminent breakout of war in few days. So that's what the commissioner here is saying. Yeah, I was extremely troubled by the narrative that was being created by pro-federal government activists with no context and nuance. But I'm glad that you say we have to focus on the structural problems, to use the Prime Minister's words. So that I think is extremely important if we are to have alleviate the problem and have a nuanced conversation.
Absolutely. I think obviously at the moment we are still in a war setting, right? And so any concession, especially any public concession, is going to be interpreted or at least seen as a sign of weakness. So the rhetoric has hardened even more. But I agree with you, and I'm sure the parties understand that the November 4 was essentially the tipping point of what was about to come. And you're also right that the federal government and the Amhara government, they were ready. Now, you are ready for something doesn't mean that you were planning on doing it. So you have to always be prepared. And I think not to be prepared would be reckless, especially considering the bravado and the military parade and all of that we were seeing in Mekelle in particular, but also at some point in Addis Ababa. And so there is no question that both parties were ready for a possible confrontation. But
no,
I think
my problem though, like one last point on this one, and then we will proceed to other few points, and then we'll try and finalize this. But then one last thing though is like this fixation with like who started the war, whose bullet came out of the barrel first. I mean, it's just to my mind, it's kind of meaningless. And then there's a historical precedent of this, right, in Ethiopia's history. So, for instance, and I think I mentioned it to you when we had a private discussion. So, if you go back and look at during the Derg era, the Red Terror, it's kind of interesting. So, you still find people, right? So, folks who are like under EPRP at the time, and then Mason folks, they still talk about like who started it first. Well, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, if you actually look at the historical document, it was obvious that the Red Terror was about to happen. It's kind of meaningless, It's just like, I mean, obviously one party has to start it. I mean, it's impossible for both sides to start the conflict at the same time, at the same moment, like the exact same moment. I mean, obviously, but then it was coming. It was a matter of days. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the crisis group report on, I think, late October, but they were basically saying war is coming. It's around the corner. We should do something about it. And so the fixation is just very troubling to my mind.
It is troubling. I think you're right, and I think that's what I'm trying to say. That the parties understand that. The public rhetoric aside, they understand that November 4 was, as I said, the tipping point. But the lead up to it, the rhetoric, the preparation, the bravado, all of that kind of was a massive signal, and it was only a matter of time before one side miscalculates. Often when you feel like you are in danger, you exaggerate the threat. And so the Tigrayans in the end thought that something was coming, and they attacked. And that is why I said, the only sympathy I have for the TPLF is that they were part of the problem, but they were not the only problem that led to the conditions that made war almost, as we see now, inevitable. And so I agree with you that we should not, of course, October 4 is important, November 4 is important. I think particularly for Ethiopians, it is important because of the brutality with which the mission was accomplished. So for a lot of Ethiopians, they think the manner with which the attack happened on the Northern Command exceeded what was militarily necessary. And so, it's not irrelevant what happened on that day. But it is part of a set of factors. It's part of a complex equation that exploded on that particular night.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. So yeah, I'll just agree with the Prime Minister here. It was the triggering point, but fixating on it doesn't help in alleviating the problem. That's basically what he's saying. So with that being said, I want to go back to a few points you made on the blueprint piece. So one, when you discussed about dialogue, you said, and I'm quoting, "The dialogue will not be successful and legitimate without the release and inclusion of key political figures who are currently in detention, notably the prominent Oromo opposition leaders, Baqqala Garba and Jawar Mohammed, and the human rights activist turned politician Iskandar Nagga." So why do you think this is important? Why do you think the dialogue will not be successful unless they participate? They're released from prison and they participate in it. Why does it have to be an all-inclusive dialogue as opposed to a dialogue between the TPLF and the federal government? Why should we think like that?
Well, so in terms of immediate peace, it has to be between the main actors to the conflict. But in terms of finding solutions to the contestations, for instance, in terms of what kind of country Ethiopia should be, what kind of federalism we should have, what kind of powers the region should have, what kind of power structures there should be at the center, these are matters that affect everyone, every person in Ethiopia, including obviously political leaders. And so there's, the first stage in terms of silencing the guns would obviously have to be to involve a smaller range of actors, particularly the TPLF, Amhara, Afar, and the Ethiopian government, and perhaps also the Ethiopian government. But the longer term, finding solutions agreeable pathways forward to the fundamental contestations that Ethiopia has been facing since essentially, particularly since the 1960s, would have to be resolved through an inclusive process. And inclusive naturally means including actors that are in jail for what I think is political violence. Of course, political violence is still a crime, but I consider political violence to have its own logic. You know, we cannot assume, we should not consider political violence merely in terms of criminal law. And so to that extent, even if there may be cases, criminal law case against some of these detained actors, I think politically advancing, making political progress may require bringing them to the fold, particularly because they represent a significant constituency. And so yes, the conflict immediately must end, and that includes a smaller range of actors, but finding solutions to the fundamental contestations affects everybody in the country, and that includes those who are in detention.
Okay, so from that, and also you've said on the piece as well that the national dialogue to be had will have to untie knots that have plagued Ethiopian politics since the 1960s, including particularly. So, you know, the kind of stuff that you just mentioned. So the historical narrative of the country, the institutional features, self-determination and ethnic federalism, and the power balance between national and regional governments. So that's all important. So would it be fair to say that at the heart of this conflict is basically a contestation about the historical narrative of the country, and broadly speaking, or as it relates to that narrative, ethnic federalism. So would it be fair to make such an assessment? Because you have folks saying no, it's not about ethnic federalism. This is not about the historical narrative or the way we view the Ethiopian state. It doesn't have to do anything with all that. It's just you have a like renegade element, a terrorist organization, TPLF, attacking Ethiopia, trying to dismantle Ethiopia, and we have to crush it. So don't talk about all of that. But then you have this other positioning, namely, broadly, like generally speaking, at the heart of this is this contestation about ethnic federalism, about the narrative, the historical narrative of the country, the identity of the state. So would it be fair to make such an assessment? What do you think?
I think it's very, very important to say first that there are differences in terms of how we perceive Ethiopian history, and based on that historical understanding, how the Ethiopian state should be organized. So there are fundamental differences, and those we need to discuss. We never really had genuine deliberation in terms of how we should first understand our history and then give institutional expression to that. We never had that. We had a few chances, when the Derg came, but Derg imposed its own version of history, its own version of institutionals. And the TPLF-led EPRDF did exactly the same. So they imposed their ideas of what the Ethiopian history was and how that should be reflected in its constitutional and institutional iteration. So there's no denying that those differences exist, and we never really had a chance to solve them through deliberation. That's one. And secondly, and this is very important, I do not think that this war is about that. I think this war fundamentally was actually about controlling the center. As I said, when Abiy Ahmed came to power, as a prime minister, he had to claim power. And most of the powers of a prime minister at that particular time were actually exercised by the TPLF leaders. And so when he claimed those powers, he was taking it from them. And so the contestation really, for me, what this war started about was about controlling the center, what kind of power should be exercised in the center, or how that should happen. And so, we have to make that distinction. But of course, once the conflict started, and actually already before, the rhetoric was with that the TPLF was saying Abiy was out to undermine Ethiopian federalism. He was out to take the powers of the regions and all of that. But that for me was a rhetoric. It was a cover to use a historical challenge that is still there, a historical difference that's still there, but in reality to pursue power, to claim power in the center, power in the center. So they were using the historical contestations to justify their claim for power in the center. And so to simplify it, yes, there are historical contestations. Yes, there are differences in terms of how those historical contestations should be given institutional and constitutional expression. And those need deliberation, dialogue to solve. But the war was not about that. It just provided the TPLF the vocabulary. It's a ready-made vocabulary, an understandable vocabulary that it can use to rally around potential support among groups in other parts of the country.
Okay, I would, if we had time, I would have pushed back against that somewhat, but I don't think it's a good time to do it. But one interesting thing you said though is about the chances we had historically for national dialogue and deliberation. So one thing that I think the TPLF dominated EPRDF could have done during the transition after the fall of the Derg in 1991 was to engage in a serious national dialogue and deliberation. So they kind of did that, right? Chartering the constitution, they tried to involve, make sure like various factions from the Ethiopian political spectrum were to participate, but then it was dominated by those who viewed Ethiopian history and Ethiopian history and Ethiopian identity in a certain way, and then you didn't have a lot of participation from what you can broadly describe as pan-Ethiopians, or even there's the legitimate concern from Amhara nationalists saying Amharas were not represented during the draft of the constitution. The EPRDF could have done that. The EPRDF could have made it like an actual, a truly all-inclusive dialogue, but then I think they missed that opportunity, and then, well, obviously went, authoritarian, extremely authoritarian way, imposing their, whatever ideological position that they have. So that was a missed chance. So with that being said, I want to touch upon one last point before we finish this up, and that is this view that, and this is not something that you've mentioned on your blueprint piece, but then this is something that I think we should discuss, because it's at the center of the war of narratives, so to speak. So there's this perceived Western media, Western institutions, Western government bias against the Ethiopian government, the federal government. So among others, the recently growing #NoMore, activism is an instance of that, or a reaction to what they perceive as a bias against the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian cause by these Western entities. So do you think that has merit? Do you think that has a foundation? And what's your reflection on that, if you can briefly?
Well, I think it's certainly not unfounded. I think, what I understand is that there's a lot of incomplete storytelling. The Western media in particular tries to look at daily events in terms of defining what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is unjust. Ethiopians, on the other hand, have a longer time horizon in terms of attributing guilt, in terms of attributing blame, and overall in terms of judging what is just and what is unjust. And so that short-sightedness, that incompleteness of the stories that the Western media tells, effectively has created a bias, particularly when the war was in Tigray. It created that bias that the TPLF was the victim, when in reality they were at the center of most of the violence in the past 3-4 decades, and even today. So I think that incompleteness is at the center of it. But there's also some Western media, such as the CNN, that deliberately and consciously have taken a very activist stand towards what is happening in Tigray. And so they were not even pretending to be reporting things. They've taken an editorial decision. They have taken a decision, for instance, that what is happening in Tigray is genocide. and they are trying to influence. Essentially, they are serving as for free lobbyists to label the Ethiopian government as a genocide here. And sometimes also there's a lot of misinformation, maybe even disinformation. I think we saw it particularly when when the TPLF forces controlled Desai. Everybody, CNN, a lot of media were reporting that the rebels were like on the outskirts of Addis and all of that, which was for me was misinforming and sometimes even deliberately disinforming. So overall, we could question or we could argue about the intention of Western media, but the consequence of the reporting, regardless of the intention, the consequence of the reporting has been to extremely discredit a government that obviously had some role in terms of how the war started, but had no choice. After the Tigrayan government, after the TPLF force attacked the Northern Command, there was really little choice left for the federal government than to fight back. And so the consequence of how they've done things has certainly had a biased implication.
Well, but I think there is a distinction to be made between, Western media, say CNN, for instance, reporting, and I agree with you, right? So, for instance, the various reports that we've seen from CNN, I would characterize them as generally the Western media. It doesn't have to be CNN, as kind of sensational, maybe something of an activist, as you've said, or general carelessness, right? Well, that's one thing. But then the claim that there is this concerted effort, there is this conspiracy by Western entities, not just the media, but including Western governments, at the forefront, the United States government, the Biden administration, to basically support the terrorist TPLF and work against the Ethiopian government to the end of like weakening the Ethiopian state, or some people say to destroy Ethiopia, well, they say lots of things. It's kind of hard to keep track of it, but yeah, basically like dismantle Ethiopia and back the TPLF. So there's this concerted effort, a kind of hidden agenda of these Western entities. So I think there's a distinction to be made between this kind of of accusations of conspiracy and then Western media, maybe sensationalism or generally carelessness. So I think the distinction is needed.
So I think. As I said, there are a few media like the CNN that have taken a position. They have already taken a position, and so they are essentially promoting a particular narrative. But with most other media, I agree with you that it is it's the way the media works that has then led to a biased understanding of the conflict. And of course, if you are an Ethiopian, if you are an Ethiopian government, when these things happen consistently, right? If it's once or twice, 3 times, you can pass it as a coincidence. But when things are consistent, they become systematic. And so whether whether they are deliberately conspiring or not, the effect is that it puts the Ethiopian government under extremely under tremendous pressure. And unfortunately, especially Western governments are influenced. The media, whether they make the right point or not, they are influential, and so they influence Western policy and all of that. So in that regard, maybe there's no conspiracy, but the effect is that a systematic distortion of the realities and the history of the conflict.
Okay, yeah, well, that somewhat makes sense. Your position is basically the media is acting in such a bad manner, and then the consequence of this. So what we're seeing here, say for instance, the sanctions and the other the pressure coming from the West is just a consequence of the consequence of the media reporting, which in your mind is not only sensational, but kind of deliberately taking an activist positioning, for instance, in the case of CNN.
Some certainly, yeah.
Okay. So with that being said, I think it's been over an hour. So like last point is just the kind of opening that, so like you can share your like reflections on the growing polarization generally regarding the war, how you think we can move forward. For instance, you can discuss about societal healing, like how do you think we can bridge the divide? What should we do about the growing polarization, and just any other reflections about the war and the consequences, and then we can finish it up.
I have a lot of confidence in the ordinary Ethiopian people. Obviously, the propaganda and all of that has created a lot of rift. It has led neighbors to raise their hands and arms against their fellow neighbors. But I still believe that people are responding to an organized elite propaganda. If we manage to silence the propaganda, and even better, if we shift that propaganda towards preaching peace, towards preaching friendliness towards each other, I think the Ethiopian people have, over and over again showed their capacity to move from tragedy to tragedy. And so the key again remains with commitment from our elites and accepting that they would benefit more in the long term from a peaceful country. So I think we've seen conflict, and of course there's always some who benefit from conflict, but I see everybody losing. The TPLF losing, Abiy Ahmed losing, Amhara's losing, Ethiopians, even those that are not directly affected by the conflict, are losing. So war, conflict, instability is a losing game for everybody. And so hopefully if our elites now go back to a peaceful means, and they from a an enlightened sense of self-interest start preaching peace among our people, I have tremendous confidence in the capacity of Ethiopians to forgive, not to forget. I think there has to be a way of accountability. We have to atone for it. We have to take responsibility for it, and there has to be deliberate efforts at reconciliation. But I believe the Ethiopian people have the capacity, subject to some sort of accountability, they have the capacity to move beyond the tragedy. And I that is actually what keeps me hopeful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, like I think it's better to be optimistic generally as we go forward, even though it's increasingly difficult to imagine how exactly we can get out of this mess. But then your trust, and I think this is a point that we need to emphasize, that ordinary Ethiopians can move forward, just having faith in everyday individuals. I think that's really important. And like that's part of the reason I wanted to talk to you. Like, even though, like, broadly speaking, you're someone who have some sympathy for the federal government, especially when it comes to the war, but nonetheless, you're willing to hear the other side, to engage in in civil conversation in good faith, which I think is much needed. And yeah, like, my hope is that we will probably have more people doing the same from all camps across the political spectrum, and then as we do that, we can hopefully bridge the divide and then move forward. Yeah.
If I can just add one thing, I think I really hope that everyone would be less certain of their understanding, their assumptions, not just about the other, but also about themselves, about their interest. I think we need to leave some space for doubt. At least when we realize that we were wrong, we can forgive ourselves, if not the other. So I think it is good to be passionate. It's good to have ideas, but it's also good to leave that little possibility that we may not be right, that we may be getting things wrong. And that gives us some sympathy to the other side.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even when we're raising arms against each other, even when we're fighting each other, we must always remember that the others, just like us, they have their fears, they have their desires, just like us. And I think we have to remember that.
Yeah. So what you said about leaving a space for doubt, and modesty, right? Don't be very self-assured. I mean, it's good to have political positionings and political outlooks. We're political animals, and we especially in this time of polarization. I mean, it's just a given. It's a given that we would subscribe to some political positioning, political ideology, but then like leaving a room for some doubt. Maybe some of my positions are wrong. Maybe there's I need to engage with the other side to learn about their version of the truth. So having this modesty, I think, is much needed. And also another point that you said, which I think is really, really important, is even if people subscribe to a camp that you think is, quote unquote, an enemy that has to be destroyed. And it doesn't mean that you have like personal, like say for instance in personal relationships. I mean, I know a few people who, like brothers and sisters, husband and wife, in a family, subscribe to opposing camps, but that doesn't put a strain on your like personal relationship. They're the same people that you have lived with prior to the war and prior to the polarization. So I think it's really important to keep that in perspective as we move forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then there was this touching thing on Twitter between which I saw I think it was on Thanksgiving or one day prior to Thanksgiving. I think on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe Thursday, Thanksgiving Day, between Hermela Ragawi and her brother Buruk. Kind of, obviously we know what the kind of position that she subscribes to, and then Buruk is a Tigray activist, and I think that created some sort of strain on the relationship. But then they solved it. They solved it on Thanksgiving, and then they retweeted each other's tweet, wishing each other happy Thanksgiving, and then like let's make sure that what's happening in the political sphere is not causing a problem to our personal relationship. And that brought tears to my eyes, honestly, when I saw that. I think it was on Thursday, because I know it's just really difficult. But then like let's try and let's try and make sure that it is not putting strain on our personal relationship. That I think is really important.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more with you. I think we have to recognize that we fight even with each other, with ourselves. We disagree with ourselves often. And we just have to recognize that doubt that we experience every day, we must experience it. There is sometimes a lot of certainty that hate fills us with. We just have to go back and realize, again, the other person is just a human as we are. And we can have some sympathy, and that is actually good for our own selves, because hate, as Mandela said, eats you up more than it eats up the enemy.
Exactly. Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate it, and I hope that I get to talk to you sometime in the future. But it was fun. It was my first episode. And I'm not, as you can tell, not very experienced doing interviews. And also,
you're giving yourself less credit. I think you're done well.
Yeah, and also a very bad flu that is the kind of troubling me. I had to mute the mic to breathe. I don't know if you've noticed.
No, I haven't noticed, and I think it's a real honor to be the first one.
Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and I hope you get well, brother.
Thank you.